Afternoon, everyone. I'm just going to give another 2 minutes or so to have everybody join, and then we'll start.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Good afternoon. I hope you can all hear me. Let's begin. I'd like to welcome you all to this afternoon's Population Science Seminar Series that's hosted by SAPRIN. And this is a monthly forum that's aimed at sharing with the scientific community health and demographic surveillance systems, connected research, as well as research in the population science that is linked to or taking place at the nodes. So please, everybody, note that this session is being recorded. To introduce myself, for those who don't know me, I'm Karen Ginsberg. I'm a senior researcher based at the SAMRC WITS Agincourt unit at the WITS School of Public Health. I have a background in migration, urbanization, and health research, and I work on a nested migrant cohort study at Agincourt and on multi-center HDSS studies on migration, social determinants, and health. And it's really a pleasure and privilege to be here today as facilitator of the session. So we're fortunate to have with us two excellent presenters who will share their research with us. They are both from the Agincourt unit. Our first speaker is Mr. Cyril Chironda, who's a data analyst and PhD fellow at the unit. And our second speaker is Dr. Belinda Njiro, who is a researcher at the unit. In terms of how we will structure the session, we'll have each presenter speak for approximately 20 or so minutes, and we'll follow each presentation with about 5 minutes of questions. At the end of the two presentations, time allowing, we'll take further questions. So you can see at the top of your screens, there's a Q&A chat box, and you can use this box at any time to make comments or to ask questions, or we will take live comments and inputs when we open for questions. So let's begin with our first presentation. So that's Cyril, who will be sharing with us the results of a study on changes in chronic disease prevalence and multimorbidity clusters among the deceased in rural Northeast South Africa. So thanks so much, Cyril, and over to you.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and thank you to the organizers for the opportunity. I am Cyril Chironda, and this afternoon I'll be presenting one of our studies in progress titled Patterns of Chronic Disease Multimorbidity Across HDSS Sites, half a decade of insight from verbal autopsy, the period being 2018 to 2022. Just as a disclaimer, this study utilizes the Gates Foundation Excess Mortality Project data that was harmonized across 17 HDSSs in Africa and Southeast and South Asia. And this is work in progress, and the full author list will be agreed upon by the relevant HDSSs. For introduction and background, when we look someone took control of my slides. I don't know who. Thank you. Yeah, chronic conditions cause about 74% of all deaths worldwide. That is roughly 41 million lives each year. And when coming back home in South Africa, Studies suggest that over 70% of South African adults live with at least one chronic condition. When we also look worldwide, over 40% of adults experience multimorbidity, which we define as the presence of 2 or more chronic conditions. We see that this causes higher prevalence the prevalence is higher in older populations. In South Africa, multimorbidity is also a growing concern, with prevalence ranging from 3% and some studies even reporting 87%. These conditions significantly impact the quality of life, finances, and the overall well-being of an individual, family, and society. They strain the healthcare system and they heighten mortality. Few, and actually, if any, studies have looked at how multimorbidities cluster, evolve over time, and how they differ across various regions of the world. So for this study, what is the aim and what were our objectives? The aims and the objectives can be summarized in one study question. What are the observed variations in reported chronic disease multimorbidity clusters across different regions of the world? And how did we do this? To answer this question, we did trend analysis that is showing the differences in reported chronic disease from 2018 to 2022. We did multimorbidity prevalence analysis, that is to determine the variations in multimorbidity reported deaths from 2018 to 2022. We then went to the heart of the matter, which is cluster identification. We identified common combination clusters of co-occurring chronic conditions across the 5-year period. For the study settings, we looked at 13 HDSS sites. 3 for this presentation, we'll focus on 3 from South Africa, that is Agincourt, Dimamo, and Ari. We used raw verbal autopsy data, which is a novel method, as this data remains a potential source for knowing the disease burden. The results also agree with prevalence numbers from other studies, especially in Agincourt, although not formally verified yet. We used latent class analysis and partitioning around medians, that is LCA and PEM from here onwards. For clustering, we used a majority rule for deciding the number of clusters in each of the models that we ran. We used the majority rule from metrics like BIC, AIC, the silhouette width, the elbow method, and this also took into consideration the local maximums and the minimums wherever relevant. We limited the maximum number of clusters to only 6 because we had 13 diseases, so having 13 clusters wouldn't say much of a story, but 6 at least would. We used 50% representation for a disease to be in a specific cluster or in a specific class. That limits wider and also that limits empty clusters. Going forward, our first set of results, just looking at the population, the population characteristics, we see that NCDs, which are hypertension, diabetes, kidney disease, and stroke are topmost reported, with chronic diseases like HIV and TB still lingering around. Hypertension and diabetes are top in Southern Africa. That is Agincourt, Ari, Dimamo, even Karonga, whilst organ diseases are top in West Africa as well as East Asia, as we see high stroke and high heart disease reports. Non-communicable diseases tend to be reported relatively more in older ages, that is 65 and above, whilst chronic diseases are affecting mostly the middle ages, 50 to 64 across all sites. Also, NCDs affect females more, while CDs and organ diseases affect males more. This could be explained by the health-seeking behavior of younger people and women. Younger people and males move and they take more risk than females and older people. Whilst females living longer than males for NCDs, they live longer such that NCDs become more lethal at older ages. When we look at the number of chronic diseases without any models, they're just looking at the pure numbers. What do we see? We see that sites like Agincourt and Karonga, MATLAB and Dhaka have multimorbidity as a norm. That is, looking at that arrow, we see that more than 50% have 2 or more diseases. That is, have either they have less of blue than green and red. As well as when we continue looking at the 25% line, we see that almost all sites, except for Kesa and Nanoro, show that 25% of the deceased had 2 or more chronic conditions reported. Multimorbidity as well increases with age, with 3 or more diseases increasing with age, that is affecting mostly those 50 plus. Females are also slightly more multimorbid than men in most, if not all sites. When we look at the combinations, like what are the combinations of these diseases that we're looking at, which ones are affecting people, we look at diabetes plus hypertension, just narrowing it down from the world to Agincourt, Dimamo, and Ari on this. We look at diabetes plus hypertension is the most frequent of the 2 disease combination at each of the 3 HDSA sites, with with hypertension plus HIV and diabetes plus HIV in second and third place. Hypertension, HIV diet is the second diet in Agincourt, but it is not seen in the other two sites. Whilst HIV TB co-occurrence is substantial in Ari and with 75 in Agincourt with 53, but it drops down in Dimamo with 21, underscoring regional variations in TB, HIV syndemic patterns. You would expect the result from Agincourt and Dimamo to be kind of the same, but that is not the case. When you look at the triad of diabetes, hypertension, and stroke, which is highlighted now, that is the leading 3-way cluster in all of the 3 sites. Moving forward to the heart of the matter, we will look at the overall clustering across the world. As we narrow it down from across the world, we go to Southern Africa, and then we end up with each of the our SAPRIN representative SAPRIN HDSA sites. So across the world, what do we see? So here we have our LCA, which is the Latin class analysis clusters on the left, and the partition around mediate, that is PEM, on the left for the full data set of the 13 HDSs. So what do we see? We see that LCA produces 6 classes from a 40% multi-disease cluster down to a rare 4 condition profile, whereas PAM yields only 4 groups. We see LCA uncovers long tails of high burden multimorbidity, whilst PEM homes in the top 3 diets, that is hypertension plus cancer, which is 50%, then hypertension plus diabetes, 22%, and TB plus HIV, which is roughly 12%. We see that there is a dominant difference. LCA's largest segment is broad, with TB plus HIV being the center, but PEM showed that hypertension plus cancer is on the center. When we look at how these clusters evolved between pre-COVID times and during COVID around the world, we see that for LCA moves from dyes to complex syndemics. Pre-COVID, one LCA class was the simple HIV plus stroke diet, that is the 30% highlighted. But in COVID period, every class now includes HIV plus TB, plus a multiple of NCDs, and 2 classes as well swell to about 38% as indicated them, carrying about 10 to 11 conditions. PEM tells a slightly different story. PEM shows TB plus HIV diet emerges into NCD mix. The standalone TB plus HIV group, which was approximately 15% pre-COVID, becomes a larger TB plus HIV plus cancer, kidney disease, and liver disease cluster, approximately 15%, dropping the count of pure 2 condition clusters from 2 down to 1. When you look at these patterns in Southern Africa, we see that PEM yields a 4 balanced groups. That is hypertension only, with about 32%, TB plus HIV with about 30%, hypertension plus diabetes with about 28%, and HIV plus hypertension about 10%. Then when we look at latent class analysis, it produces one huge multi-morbid disease class with almost 60%, and three much smaller classes with 18%, 14%, and 8% respectively, which are wider. When we look at how this evolved during the period of time, PEM shows that the dominant TB plus HIV group drops in size during COVID period, whilst diabetes and hypertension only clusters grow, indicating a shift towards non-communicable disease. LCA shows that one large multi-morbid cluster with HIV at the center dominates, that is around 50% during COVID, and a new large TB plus HIV and asthma and other NCDs cluster emerges with about 60%. So this shows that both methods show an increase in mixed and complex multi-morbid in Southern Africa during COVID periods, with less pure diets. When we narrow it down to Agincourt, in Agincourt, we see that LCA collapses Agincourt into 2 broad multi-morbid profiles. That is 62% with TB, asthma, epilepsy, and others, whereas PEM yields 3 specific groups. That is hypertension only, TB plus hypertension and diabetes. The story here is infectious versus NCD separation. LCA largest class mixes TB with multiple NCDs, but PEM isolate the TB plus HIV diet distinctly and separating it from pure hypertension and diabetes. When you look at the shifts during and during COVID, we see that the LCA shows that the TB-centered class grows from 58% pre-COVID to 66%, that is during COVID. And the stroke class shrinks from 42% to 34%, whilst PEM shows a rise in TB plus HIV overlap. The pure hypertension group drops from 41% to 32%, and the TB plus hypertension plus HIV plus or minus hypertension cluster rises from 29% to 35%, with hypertension plus diabetes diet roughly being stable. This story in DiMarmo is kind of the same. We see in DiMarmo between our 2 methods, there is a story of granularity versus simplicity. LCA splits DiMarmo into 3, 40, 20, and 40% classes. 2 heavy multi-morbid profiles, one with TB plus HIV centered, one which is metabolic centered, and the other which is a smaller mixed group. Whilst PEM instead gives 4 clear groups: hypertension with 26%, HIV plus cancer 36%, hypertension plus diabetes, and then TB only, which is small, 7%. We see a dominant, we see kind of a shift. LCA, its largest segment is 40%, is the TB plus HIV, which with NCDs, whereas PEM peaks at HIV plus cancer, that is 46%. When you look at how these have changed over during and pre and during COVID, see LCA clusters, we see that TB plus HIV classes slightly grow during COVID, whilst cardiometabolic clusters shrinks. PEM shows that diabetes plus hypertension drops from 45 to 28%, whilst HIV monocluster included other diseases in COVID time. Both methods emphasizes on infectious multimorbid clusters during COVID, with pure NCD clusters being less dominant. When we look at the last of our site, that is ARI, we see that SCA finds 4 groups, including a tiny group that is highlighted there, that is asthma plus dementia class of 1%, whereas PEM gives 3 clear dyads. TB plus HIV prominence. In LCA, the large TB plus HIV plus multi-NCD profile captures about 57% of the people, whilst PEM has the TB plus HIV dyad smaller, that is 39%. There's a hypertension split. PEM separates hypertension into hypertension plus stroke, hypertension plus diabetes, whilst LCA merges all into broad multi-condition clusters. When you see the evolution that came with the pandemic, pre-COVID, LCA has 0 TB-centric classes. However, during COVID, we see that almost every class shows TB. When you look at PEM shows pre-COVID TB clusters. It shows TB clusters, that is TB plus HIV, TB plus cancer, and TB only, made up only up about 47%, as was highlighted, and hypertension only, which is in red, accounts for around 53%. During COVID, TB windows to about 26%, whilst that large TB plus dementia cluster plus hypertension grows bigger to about 74%. So what are the key conclusions and takeaways of all this information overload? We see that key multimorbidities vary by site. Across all HDSs, there's the three dyes: hypertension plus diabetes, hypertension plus cancer, TB plus hypertension consistently dominate, but with site-specific emphasis. ARI shows the strongest of TB plus HIV burden. Dimamolin towards NCD pairs, and Agincourt presents a balanced mix of the infectious and the cardiometabolic cluster. Pandemic era shifts shift towards infectious overlap. We see that during COVID period, TB-centered multi-disease clusters, especially TB plus HIV plus some NCDs, grew at almost all the 3 sites, whilst pure NCD groups like HP hypertension, they shrank, highlighting an amplified syndemic of chronic, infectious, and non-communicable conditions. We see the complementary insights from the 2 clustering methods that were used in the study. We see PEM delivers straightforward, actionable multimorbidities, that is mono and dyads, for targeted interventions, whilst LCA uncovers deep, high multimorbid condition profiles that we would rather sometimes overlook. Together, these methods offer both precision targeting and a full picture of the syndemic complexity for health planning in our HDSA sites. I think that should bring me to the end of the presentation. Thank you, and any questions?
Thank you so much, Cyril. Excellent presentation, really rich data sources and a lot of analytical work that's gone into this. Very interesting to see the variation across the sites, and and, you know, both across the South African sites, but also more broadly. We'll open for a few minutes of questions. I'm just going to read out one of the questions in the Q&A box from Dr. van Straten. With regards to disease distribution per site, it is interesting to see Jeremiah and Karen have significant kidney disease. What could be the cause of this kidney disease? Because I would guess diabetes and hypertension or even HIV as causes of kidney disease, yet here it is explicitly divided.
I'll just try to read and understand the question. What could be the cause of this kidney disease? So that is around Aramea and Hara and Kesa. So those are mostly they are Ethiopian sites. Without the full knowledge of it, as well as with our analysis still going, I wouldn't give a full picture. But most also it could be how the data is captured. So some of the variations are also in capturing of data. You find out that some sites do not capture some data and some sites do capture some data, as this is data that is being captured through verbal autopsies. Yeah, but as for the specifics, I think because our next step here is to look at the risk factors. So I think that should answer the question better. Yeah.
Thank you. I hope that answers the question. We have a hand up, Philippe.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yeah, all right. I missed a bit the beginning of the presentation, so I was not. Can you tell me? Can you remind me of how you identify the chronic diseases? Is this through causes of death, or how is it?
So we used the raw verbal autopsy answers from the verbal autopsy questionnaire. So what mostly is done is mostly surveys are done on people who are alive, and we would get their self-reported diseases that they're suffering from. However, one of the rich sources of data is the verbal autopsy. So rather than running this through our InterVA or the other verbal autopsy algorithm, we did not run through it. Rather, we just used them as self-reported not causes of death, but diseases that
symptoms,
yeah, symptoms or diseases that the deceased was suffering from. Yes, yeah.
Right, because that might be a concern, because some of the sites might record the symptoms a bit differently, and the combination of symptoms might be interpreted differently depending on the setting. Okay, I'm wondering if how reliable, say, the identification of those conditions are, you know. And related to that, whether the two methods, LCA and PAM, are whether they are measuring some variability in the way that symptoms are recorded from one side to the next. So I know it's a difficult question, because of course it's difficult to disentangle what are the true symptoms from the interpreted symptoms, you know.
Yes.
So I'm wondering how can we disentangle the two? I'm not sure there is a straight answer to that. And also, I was a bit puzzled by the differences between the two methods. How can we? What comes out of the? We see that they are measuring something different, but what is? What are the assumptions behind the two methods? And because presumably the differences are comes from the embedded assumptions that are different in those two methods. But because if we want to use the two methods, we have also to give guidelines as which method is more suitable for which purpose, you see.
Yes. So
otherwise, congratulations for the work. It's quite rich and really interesting. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. To the best of my recollection of the questions, I think for the first one, in terms of the differences in sites and how they capture the data. So the verbal autopsy tool that was used, or that is being used by the these HDSS sites, it is a standardized or a standard it is standardized by the World Health Organization. So it is used it was or it is or it also continuing being used across all these 17 sites. So the differences now might be sometimes site focus. So you find that maybe some sites usually might focus on maybe child health, which means they might not show some of the diseases that affect older or adults. Some sites maybe focus mostly on HIV and TB, which means in terms of NCDs, the numbers might be lower. However, in terms of the standardization of the data, yeah, it is. However, there is data collection variability across different sites. And then when we look at the differences in the methods, that is PEM and LCA, so what as you mentioned, the assumptions are what differentiates the two methods. So LCA, latent class analysis, is a pure probabilistic statistical method that is rather assuming that people or the viewed characteristics that we view, the clusters come from anything else. They assume that there is a latent variable that we do not see that will cause these clusters. So when we do the modeling, the similarities, especially in probability of one person being in a class, is down to that probability or down to that hidden variable, that is the latent variable. Whilst partitioning around medioids assumes distance. It's a pure machine learning model rather than statistical. So it assumes distance, that the distance between two individuals can tell us if they are close enough to be in the same class, in the same cluster, or in the same class or not. As this can also be seen usually with the results. So we can see that when we look at the results, in most of these results, you'll find that LCA shows broader clusters, whilst PEM shows slightly finer clusters. So LCA, the good thing about LCA is it will show us some of the things, like I think there is something like where we could see here
Sorry,
dementia.
Cyril, I'm sorry to cut you, but we do need to move on. Can you, in a few minutes, wrap up and thank you?
Okay, thank you. Yeah, here we can see that PEM will capture those little things that we might overlook, like dementia, whilst PEM will give us the overall or the overview picture of almost everything. Yeah.
Thanks so much. That was a very
Thanks.
useful set of questions, and I'm sure you could have an opportunity to connect further.
Yes, thank you.
I'd like to next call on Belinda, who will be talking to us about overall and cause-specific mortality and associated risk factors among middle-aged older South Africans, and these are findings from the HALSI. So over to you, Belinda. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karen, and thank you, Cyril, for that first great presentation. As introduced, my name is Belinda Njiro. I am with the SMRC VETS Agincourt Research Unit, and on behalf of the co-authors, I'll be presenting on the overall and cause-specific mortality and associated risk factors among middle-aged and older South Africans, and these are findings from HALSI in rural South Africa. So up from 2005, there has been a decrease in overall mortality levels, as well as an increase in life expectancy in South Africa. And this is mainly because we know HIV has contributed greatly in disease burden for South Africa. So this reduction has really been because of the wide availability of antiretroviral treatment, which also causes most of this population to live longer and also at higher risk of NCDs, or non-communicable diseases, alongside HIV and AIDS. And this, even though we've seen decrease in mortality overall, because there is an increase in NCDs, then the mortality tends to increase because of this double burden of disease. So for this specific study, we looked to investigate various demographic, socioeconomic, self-reported, as well as objectively measured health-related factors that were associated with both overall and cause-specific mortality in rural South Africa. Specifically, we quantified the overall mortality rates for middle-aged and older adults. We stratified these mortality rates by age, sex, as well as causes of death. And then we determined factors that were associated with all-cause mortality and cause-specific mortality. So as previously mentioned, this is a HALSI study that was conducted back in 2014, where the baseline or the first wave of HALSI cohort was recruited. And this cohort included about 5,000 individuals, and the distribution was about 50% men and 50% women, and these were aged 40 years or above. So it's middle-aged and older adults. So we did a prospective cohort study in Agincourt study site in Mpumalanga province, where we included both self-reported and objectively measured health-related factors from the baseline wave, and then the subsequent mortality data and cause of death information were collected from Agincourt Health and Demographic Surveillance System. So these are the different variables or measurements that we did at baseline, and these include the social demographic factors such as age, sex, marital status, level of education, wealth index, as well as religion. Then we collected 2 lifestyle factors, smoking and alcohol use, medical history factors such as self-rated health, where individuals were asked to rate their health on the day of data collection, also recorded limitations in activities of daily living, history of tuberculosis, stroke, heart attack, heart failure, or angina. We also did some physical assessment where we measured body mass index, blood pressure, blood sugar, grip strength, and walk time, which are considered part of the physical function variables, HIV status, as well as viral load for those who are HIV positive. So for the cause of death data, which is part of our outcome, we collected this information from the Agincourt Health Demographic Surveillance System annual vital event, and this is through the verbal autopsy interviews that were conducted with caregivers or relatives of the deceased, where they report the signs and symptoms of illness or injury prior to death, and this was collected between 1 month to 11 months after death. So after collecting the verbal autopsy, we used the inter-VA probabilistic model to assign probable causes of death. So the model usually assigns up to 3 likely causes of death with associated likelihoods, where we chose the most probable cause from the model. So from our analysis, we had quite a number of causes of death from the verbal autopsy, and we categorized this into 8 major categories, and these are HIV and tuberculosis, other infectious diseases, which this would encompass any infectious diseases apart from HIV, TB, and will range from sepsis, acute respiratory infections, pneumonia, diarrhea, malaria, etc. Then we had cardiovascular diseases, we had neoplasms, any type of cancer, and then metabolic causes, which most of these data from diabetes, as well as malnutrition. Then we had a group of other NCDs, which include asthma, epilepsy, etc. So any other NCD that is not cardiovascular or diabetes was classified as other NCDs. And then external causes are mainly accidents and injuries. And then we had indeterminate causes, meaning the model could not assign any cause of death. So for the data analysis, we calculated the mortality rates from survival analysis technique for right censored data to look for factors or to determine factors associated with mortality. We used the Cox proportional hazard model while controlling for age and sex. And then for cause-specific mortality, we used fine and grained competing risk model with sub-distribution hazards. So for each of the cause-specific mortality or risk of mortality from a certain disease, we considered the risk of dying from other causes of disease as well using this model. So I'll go into the results. So present the results into 2 main groups. We have the all-cause mortality or overall mortality and associated factors, and then I'll go to the cause-specific mortality and associated factors. For the all-cause mortality within a period of 7 years, from 2014 up to 2021, we recorded a total of 1,116 deaths, 491 among women, 625 among men, and this was a total of about 29,000 person years. So this would result into a mortality rate of 38.5 deaths per 1,000 person years. So from the first graph, we can see that mortality rates do increase with age for both males and females. And we can see survivorship substantially higher for females in each age group. And this female survival advantage is mainly contributed by different exposure levels to key risk factors such as alcohol use or smoking, as well as better health-seeking behaviors and availability of social protection for females. The second graph shows the age standardized mortality from 2015 up to 2021. And as we can see, the green graph shows the overall age standardized mortality, while the red is for female and blue is for male. So we can see that overall, for all groups, the mortality was going down from 2015 up to around 2019, only to start increasing from 2020 and 2021 for both groups. And this can also be somehow, part of this could be attributed to the COVID-19 that might have contributed to death here, especially in 2021. So this graph shows the risk factor associated with all-cause mortality. And we can see that from the social demographic factors, Christians and those who reported African tradition, those who are currently or previously married were less likely to die, as well as those who had a higher wealth quartile. And also we can see that overweight, which is interesting to see, that overweight is less likely associated with those who are overweight who are less likely to die. or to be recorded for the all-cause mortality. And we know that there is a role of other measures of obesity that would best represent obesity measures, such as waist circumference, waist to hip ratio. So it does challenge our method of checking some of these obesity measures. Then we had a number of factors that were associated with an increase in mortality rate, and these include history of smoking, reporting moderate to very bad self-rated health, being underweight, reporting any limitation of activity of daily living, and slow walk pace. And these two are mainly focusing or they're indicating physical function status of adults. Then we had also history of hypertension, diabetes, and history of stroke, as well as those who are HIV positive on ART, but with no viral suppression and a previous history of tuberculosis. So now I'll move to the cause-specific mortality. So this is a description of some of the mortality fraction from different causes of death that we looked at earlier, the 8 groups. So we can see that majority of deaths were from cardiovascular causes, followed by other infectious diseases, neoplasms, and HIV. Those are the main 4 groups that had contributed the highest mortality fraction. So if you look closely at the 2 groups for men and women, we can see that cardiovascular accounted for highest mortality fraction for female more than male. And we can see these sex differences as well for neoplasms, HIV, and external causes, which for these 3 groups, men had a higher fraction. So this again shows closely some of these mortality fraction from different diseases for each age group and for male and female. So we can see that we have higher mortality fraction from HIV and TB for females compared to males, especially in the earlier ages. We can see here for men and for females, we have more HIV and TB fractions for females. And then we have neoplasm-related mortality fraction, which is higher for male, especially in earlier ages compared to females. And then we can see that also slightly higher cardiovascular-related death for female in earlier ages compared to male. So this graph shows the competing mortality risk for male and female in different age groups. And we can see that for HIV and TB, other NCDs, as well as external causes, we can see that the increased mortality risk per age is higher for male. Male are more at higher risk when compared to female in these graphs. And then for other infectious disease, neoplasms and cardiovascular, the risk still increases with age, but female shows a bit of more higher risk compared to male for these 3 groups. Then I'll go over each of the causes of death, the 8 disease group that we talked about, and look at risk factors that are associated with this specific disease-specific mortalities. So for HIV-related mortality, we can see that those that had a higher wealth quartile were less likely to die from HIV, while those who are not married compared to those who are married, which might be explained by exposure to high sexual risk factors as well. And those who reported moderate to bad self-rated health, those who are underweight, and those who had HIV and ART status, different HIV ART status, as we can see that the risk of death from HIV is high among those who had ART, who were on ART but had high viral load or had no viral suppression. Also, those with history of TB. Then for the infectious disease mortality, we can see that education and religion again plays a role here, where they have a lower risk of mortality from infectious diseases. those who reported no limitation in activity of daily living, as well as those who had strong grip strength as a measure of physical function had a lower risk of dying from infectious disease. And then those who were on ART with viral suppression also had lower risk than those who were even HIV negative. Then history of alcohol use, reporting bad self-rated health, obesity, hypertension, and diabetes were associated with higher risk of infectious disease-related mortality. So for the cancer neoplasm mortality, we can see again a measure of physical function. Strong grip strength was protective of cancer-related death. And those who, which is what is interesting here, is those who had higher education, where education was protective for infectious disease-related mortality, but education is associated, higher education associated with higher risk of death from neoplasms compared to no education. Then those with history of smoking and those who reported very bad self-rated health, those who were underweight, as well as those who were on ART with no viral suppression had higher risk of cancer-related mortality. So metabolic causes, this is mainly diabetes and malnutrition. We can see that those who reported no limitation in activity of daily living, and those who reported who had strong grip strength, were less likely to die from metabolic causes, and those who are underweight and diabetic were more likely to die from metabolic causes. For the cardiovascular-related death, we had a religion, those who were overweight and those who had no limitations, being protected from dying from cardiovascular causes, while those who were widowed and not married and those who reported bad self-rated health had high risk of cardiovascular mortality, as well as, this is still on cardiovascular, we had strong grip strength as a protective factor. And another interesting finding is those who are on ART and had viral suppression were less likely to die from cardiovascular diseases. And this could be because of the HIV advantage on controlling hypertension and NCDs, because these are exposed to health services compared to those who are HIV negative. Also, those who had slow pace or longer walk time, those who are hypertensive, diabetic, with a history of stroke or heart attack were also at higher risk of dying from cardiovascular causes. Then the other group is other NCDs. And here we saw that widowed status, reporting bad self-rated health, being overweight and obese, and a history of TB was associated with high mortality. And while for external causes, those who were widowed or never married were at higher risk of mortality, and those with higher wealth quartile were less likely to die from external causes. So a bit of number of limitation for findings. We had a number of missing data for some independent variable, which is common considering our 7-year observation time. Also, several of these variables were assessed using self-reported data, such as alcohol use and smoking, which might have introduced risk of social desirability and reporting bias. And we recommend that future study extend to use objective measures. So in conclusion, our findings suggest increasing mortality among middle-aged and older adults, and we have seen a double burden of cardiovascular and mortality from other infectious diseases as well, even above HIV and TB. And also there are quite a number of health-related socioeconomic disparities and lifestyle factors, disability and functional status factor that remain significant contributor to mortality. And we do recommend that intervention that target managing disability and physical function together with strategies to tackle other infectious diseases for older adults are important to tackle this double burden of diseases. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Belinda. Great presentation, also very rich data and interesting results. We can turn now to maybe 2 questions in the interests of concluding in time. I don't see any in the chat. Does anybody want to ask Belinda a question? So a question's come in from Augustine. Did you compare InterVA results to other tools used for death assignment? What problems did you face when using InterVA?
Okay, thank you, Augustine. Yes, we did compare InterVA with in silico VA agreement, and we had over 90% agreement between the 2 tools that assign causes of death, which was good. But in terms of challenges, I wouldn't speak of any problems that we faced specifically for InterVA, but we did use InterVA because of the findings that we validated these 2 measures, comparing InterVA and silico VA, and we found that specifically for older adults, InterVA performed much better. This is why we went with it. But we did do some sort of sensitivity analysis to look at the agreement between in silico VA and InterVA, and found that they agree in most of the causes of death. Yeah.
Thank you. Another comment that's come in the chat from Philippe. Great presentation, but risk of table 2 fallacy when putting both distal and proximate determinants in the same model. One should not interpret all covariance as total effects because the distal determinants are generally confounding factors. One should interpret only the proximate determinants, e.g. health conditions prior to death, and not the distal determinants, e.g. SES, religion, marital status. I think that's a very valuable comment.
Yeah. Thank you. I'll take that into consideration when interpreting this.
Thank you. So we're just almost on time. And thanks for the engagement and for the very useful set of questions. Thank you so much to Cyril and Belinda for just very enlightening and well-presented inputs today. And yes, thanks to everybody on the team. It's been a pleasure to facilitate this session, and thank you to all who participated. Look forward to seeing you on future seminars.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.